Here's a request that came in by email. It says, every time I try to mix a complement into yellow or orange, it just turns to mud. I can't make this work. Would you please do a quick tip showing me how to make it work? And this person says, also, how do you mix colors on the palette without spreading them out all over the palette? How about a two for today? Well, let's first address the mixing complements without getting mud. Now, I'm going to show you before and after to make this a little bit clearer. So say we're using the complements of yellow and purple, or yellow and violet. Those two are usually the ones that people struggle with. And so let's say, okay, we're using yellow. Let's just assume that in the painting. And we need to reduce its intensity. That's why we mix a violet intent, or we also can mix a complement to create a shadow, or kind of a deeper shadow area. But when we mix that purple into it, and this is a purple, a violet. This is called dioxazine purple. But if you see, if I mix it in there, you see it gets darker, and well, I guess that person would call it sort of muddy, like that. But if you want to keep it the same value, you need to value correct first. I've put some words up here that are keywords to both parts of this quick tip. Value correct is the term you need to remember if you want to lower the saturation or the intensity of any color with the complement, which in my opinion is really the most the best way to lower it. But never mind about that. Here's what we do. These two need to be the same value if we want the mixture to be in that same value range. And so before adding the purple into that, if you want to keep it the same value, before adding the purple to that, let's just pull some white over here, we value correct that purple. And what that means is that we add white into it. And so just take a little bit at a time of this dioxazine purple. You see, it doesn't take much to just tint that, because this yellow, this is Hansa yellow. It's the Hansa yellow medium made by Gamblin. It's the same hue as the Hansa yellow light made by Utrecht. So, or cadmium yellow. Or cadmium yellow light, depending on the brand. So that's pretty close. That's pretty close to a value correction. Now let me show you what will happen now and the difference. Well, let's just put the difference up here so you can see. So here's the result without the value correct. Meaning if you're doing just a gradation of intensity, or if you're working in a light field of color of yellow, and some of it is a lower intensity, a field of wheat would be a lower intensity, or even the intensity could get lower if it's a fall leaves or that sort of thing. So anyway, and so you really can't control the intensity or the saturation and the value at the same time without doing that value correct. So this is the result without the value correction. Now let me show you the result with the value correction. So I'll bring the yellow down so I don't want that contaminated, and I bring a bit of this violet into it, and you can see it right here on the palette. It begins to change saturation without changing the value, and it doesn't look muddy. And so there is your key to value correction. Now let's put a sample of that up right here, and there you are. Let's get more on the brush. There we go. So, and then we know that we can vary that. Just keep the value correction the same, and you can vary the saturation simply by the amount of yellow. If you add more of the high intensity yellow back into it, then you get a very slightly desaturated yellow, which would be something like that. Well, I need to pull the brush out before I do that. Let's just try that again. Something like this. There we go. Yeah. All right. So that is pretty much the answer to any of the complement sets that you're working with. If you're working with, I'll put the color wheel up here to talk about this just for a second. Right here is a good place. So you can see whatever, it's a yellow-orange, blue-violet, and blue-violet is very much darker than yellow-orange. So value correct blue-violet. And orange, blue, and you can see the warmer colors especially need that to happen. If you're working with warm. The cooler colors, it's going to get a little lighter if you're wanting to desaturate the cooler color with a warmer color. It's going to get a little lighter, but not significantly lighter. You don't have that same effect. However, with a lot of the cool colors, we have desaturated colors, such as for the orange, for example, burnt sienna is desaturated. It does lean a little bit more towards red in some brands, but that would mix with the blue without really getting muddy. The other thing about not getting muddy is control the amount that you put, or the amount of the saturation or the complement that you put into the saturated color. So that would solve that problem for you. It might not be a bad idea, just for fun, just to go around the color wheel and experiment with how much will you need to value correct before you use a darker color into its complement, which is lighter, in order to desaturate it. Very simple little exercise, just that one step, value correct. That's the word I want you to remember. Now for part two of her question, that's one I get a lot from people. How do you mix colors on the palette without having to go all over the place? Well, two things. One, and I hope I remember the second. If you're mixing a color on the palette, that you mix it with the palette, and if this is the color that you're going to be using throughout the painting, and you're changing the color, which is usually the reason we mix a color. So I'm going to pull here. This is Viridian. So I'll just pull some Viridian down here. Now, if you start out with the mixture, only put as much paint here as you think you're going to need, maybe just a little bit more. But when you put it down, usually when we do that, we would come out of the tube. I just pulled it from my palette. But even when you come directly out of the tube on a color, try to keep the color kind of centrally located if you're going to be mixing. So instead of having it string out, like a lot of times we do if we're setting the palette up, we'll string the color out so that we can pull that color down with a brush in various areas without contaminating the area that we used. So to begin with, try not to squeeze it out all over the place, and that will help it to not spread all over the palette as you're mixing. All right, so suppose now what I want to do with that is I want to, this is a blue-green, and I want to create a really high-intensity yellow-green, and so I would want to add yellow to it to do that. Well, the best thing to do, first of all, in order to be able to control the amount of color, you don't just squeeze the yellow directly here. You squeeze the yellow somewhere else on the palette. And I already have some here. Let me just put some more out there. Put the yellow somewhere else on the palette. In other words, put one color of the one that you're mixing on the palette itself. Put the other color of the one you're mixing somewhere other than on the palette, so that you have control over the results that you're going to get. Now usually the reason you get that results of the color spreading all over is the first mixture that you make is not what you wanted. So you try to adjust it and you reach for more color and you end up and you work it and work it and work it and it ends up spreading all over the palette. So this will help you to avoid doing that. It's just a technical thing, but it's a very important technical thing. Okay, here we go. So if we take just a little bit of time and say what I really want, I want kind of a low value, a darker value of a really high intensity yellow green. And so I'm going to bring just a little bit of green. In working with color, we begin to learn the proportions that are going to give us certain results. So plot this, get a little bit on the tip of the palette knife, not on the edge of the palette knife, on the tip of the palette knife, put it in the middle and push down and pull in like this. Now pull towards the center, this group of words right here, pull towards the center, from the edge to the center, to mix, not stir. If you stir, it's going to spread out. And so you just pull it like if you were creaming butter with a knife or with a spatula. You pull it from the edges towards the center and mix. Now I got pretty close right there to that yellow green. I mean to that the higher intensity green, but say I didn't, say I wanted, I say, okay, that's not quite right. Well, I just do that again. But clean off the palette knife, then reach for another amount of yellow. Now, if you need to control the amount you pick up, pay attention to the amount you pick up, and rather than just to randomly grab paint and throw it in. And same thing, put it in the center, and then pull it from the edges to the center. And you will eventually have the mixture. You see what I'm doing right here? You eventually have the mixture that you need without it spreading all over the palette. Now there's a technical thing I want to point out also that will aid you in this, and that is how you use that palette knife itself and the kind of palette knife you use. Those little plastic palette knives are not worth a flip. They're stiff. They don't give you the flexibility you need in order to make those mixtures. And so I would say if you can't afford a nice flexible palette knife, request it for your birthday. You choose what you want and request it for your birthday. The more flexible the palette knife, you see this one? See how nice and flexible? More flexible, the easier it is to work. So be careful about the kind of palette knife. My preference is to use the trowel palette knife because it gives you more leverage. Instead of being straight handled, if you're straight handled, your tendency is going to be work just on the tip. But if you have the trowel shape, you have the capability of coming down flatter on the blade itself. So there's a real advantage in getting a really good quality palette knife. And the way you use that palette knife, now there's some do's and don'ts that will aid you in getting good mixing without it spreading all over the palette. And one is, don't mix just with the tip. Mix it, if you notice what I'm doing here, I've got it at about a 45-degree angle and I'm pulling it in from the sides like that, but I'm staying on the tip, but I'm mixing at about a 45-degree angle. And you can see how much of that palette knife, not very much, but it's not just the tip. Now I have seen people that are doing this just with the tip, and that's going to cause you to have a little difficulty in getting that mixture homogeneous. So those are the tips I would offer you. And here are the 3 points I'd like for you to remember, because if you remember those 3 points, you should be able to do that skill just fine. First, about the value, always value correct before you mix complementary colors. As far as keeping the paint from spreading all over the palette, start out with a flexible palette knife and one that has the trowel blade so that you have more leverage. And as you're mixing, pull towards the center. Pick up the paint and put it in the center of the paint you're mixing it with. and then push down and pull towards the center as you go around it. And then you're not going to have the paint spreading all over the palette so that you end up having very little space left to paint in. Give that a try. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.